I'm so elected. It's like now he has
All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome back to another week of Past to Present 2025. My name's Julia, and I'm an educator here at Columbia River Maritime Museum. We are welcoming author Rod Scher this week, who's going to be talking to us about the ship of lost souls and the tragic wreck of the steamship Valencia. You may notice as we're going through our presentation today, and if you attended last week, that there are auto subtitles at the top of our slides. That's an accessibility feature that we're offering to try to make our programs as inclusive as possible. But if you have any feedback about the best ways we can do that, please feel free to let me or our education director, Katie, who's in the back of the room, know. If you could also please take a moment to silence your cell phones, I would greatly appreciate that. Rod Scher is the former editor of Smart Computing magazine and the author of Sailing by Starlight, The Remarkable Voyage of Globe Star and Leveling the Playing Field, The Democratization of Technology. He is the editor and annotator of recent editions of Joshua Slocum's classic nautical memoir, Sailing Alone Around the World, and of Richard Henry Dana's classic, 2 Years Before the Mast, all from Sheridan House Publishers. His latest book is Ship of Lost Souls, The Tragic Voyage of the Steamship Valencia. Rod began his career teaching high school English and journalism in Oregon and California. After several years in the classroom, he left teaching to become an editor at Harcourt Brace Jovanovich in San Diego, California, where he edited a variety of humanities texts and participated in the development of computerized test preparation and textbook management products. Now, semi-retired, Rod travels the country in a small motorhome with his wife, Leslie, writing and editing as the opportunity arises. When not on the road, Rod lives in Depot Bay, Oregon. So without further ado, please welcome Rod Scher.
Good morning. Thank you for coming out. It's a beautiful day, and I appreciate your being willing to spend part of it with us. Julia mentioned I was I'm retired, but apparently I'm not very good at it because here I am. So I've been looking forward to speaking here for a couple of reasons, actually. One is Astoria, I don't need to tell you this, Astoria and its surroundings are just sort of maritime stories are baked into the area. It's everybody here is or knows of a lot of maritime stories, nautical legends, and things like that. So I get the feeling that people here are more attuned to these sorts of nautical tales, maybe, than in Nebraska, which is where we came from before we lived here. The second reason is I've been to this museum a few times before, and I've always admired it. And it's an incredible place. This museum is outstanding. So I've been looking forward to speaking at it. The people here are wonderful. The facility is great. The educational outreach program is very, very impressive. And that's due in a large part to folks like you. You are the people who make this museum what it is. The staff, of course, does a wonderful job, but without you all, what would they have to do? So this is kind of a tribute to you, really. And we thank you for supporting your museum. The Ship of Lost Souls, Julia mentioned that I was an editor. I was the editor of a magazine called Smart Computing. I don't know if anybody remembers that magazine. Editors are an odd bunch. Anybody here an editor before I insult a bunch of editors? Okay, good. To give you an idea, the title of this book is Ship of Lost Souls, but editors spent a long time arguing about whether it should be Ship of Lost Souls or The Ship of Lost Souls. This apparently mattered a great deal to the editors. You can see that we ended up with just Ship of Lost Souls. I was an English major in college. That's probably not surprising, which is why I don't have a real job. Instead, I became an editor and a writer. But one of the pluses of being an English major is that we talked a lot about tragedy. You know, classical tragedies, Shakespearean tragedies, Greek tragedies, Hamlet and Oedipus and Ulysses and all of these. And you notice that the subtitle of this book is The Tragic Wreck of the Steamship Valencia. How many people here have heard of the Valencia and its not that many. It's interesting. When Leslie and I were on Vancouver Island, which is where the Valencia crashed into the rocks, nobody there had heard of the Valencia either. And we couldn't figure out why. Somebody said that it was because nobody on Vancouver Island actually comes from Vancouver Island. They're all from, California or someplace. So we had a great time doing the research, but it was surprising how few people have heard about this story. At any rate, the tragic story is, I'm not sure when I came up with that title that I really gave a lot of thought to the word tragic. And as a former recovered English teacher, I probably should have given it more thought. But the more I thought about it, it really is a true tragedy in the classical sense, in the sense that, for example, that you have a tragic hero. And you have a tragic hero who's sort of undone by some sort of tragic flaw. Very often, that flaw has to do with what the Greeks called hubris, excessive pride that makes smart people do stupid things. And in our case, we have a tragic hero. And we have to push the correct button. There we go. He's got this tragic flaw. He's a noble, respected person, but he experiences a reversal of fortune. And you get the idea that his misfortune is somewhat undeserved, although I'm not so sure in this case. This is our tragic hero, Oscar Johnson. He was the captain of the Valencia. And I think when we look at Oscar Johnson, we're looking at a good man, an experienced seaman. He began in the Norwegian Navy at the age of 14 and eventually became a merchant marine captain. He was intelligent. He was experienced. He was well liked. He was sober at a time when that really meant something in the merchant marine. He had a lot going for him. And I mentioned he was an experienced sailor, but I don't know that he was experienced as a captain. And that's part of what got him into trouble. He started making mistakes very, very early in this 3-day voyage. It was supposed to be a 3-day trip from San Francisco to Seattle, up the Strait of San Juan de Fuca, but he missed that eastward turn. I'll show you a map here in a minute, and kept going straight right into the rocks off of the west coast of Vancouver Island. Did not end well at all. 136 people died, including every woman and child. There are some reasons that the women and children perished. We'll get into that in a minute. Here we can see the map of what was supposed to have been his voyage. He should have turned east into the strait there. But he missed that. we'll get into in a minute. We'll get into why he missed the turn. I think part of Captain Johnson's problem was that he had only sailed this route once before, and it was at a different time of year. Now, I don't know how much you know about currents, but they change. Sometimes they change seasonally. And in this case, you have a current called the Davidson current that flows mostly south during the summer months, but more like north, at least in this area, during the winter months. And Captain Johnson had only sailed this route once before, and it was in the summer. So he was not counting on this current. He's about to make a terrible mistake based on that. This is what the ship looks like. This is not the ship. This is her sister ship, the SS Puebla. We don't have a lot of great pictures. We do have some great drawings, though, thanks to Molly. Molly Dumas is the illustrator of this book, and she's got some prints. Are you going to display more prints or sell prints or something? You may be able to buy prints from her later. Here's one of Molly's drawings, this time of the actual Valencia, as close as we could get it anyway. If you write a book about something that occurred in 1906, you don't have a lot of great photographs that you're able to use. On the plus side, the photographs you do find are going to tend to be in the public domain, so you're free to use them. But you're not going to find as many good photographs as you would like. You're certainly not going to find a photograph of the actual wreck, which is drawn in that image on the far right over there. I mentioned that Captain Johnson started making errors. The very first error he made was not something he did, but something he did not do, something he failed to do. How many people have been on a cruise? A lot of people. You'll recall that very early in the cruise, there is some sort of lifeboat drill. And that makes sense because you don't want to do it late in the cruise. It could be too late. So early on, you want to get the crew together. Now, the crew should probably know already which lifeboats they're assigned to, how to raise and lower them, how to, herd the passengers into them. But the passengers certainly don't know which lifeboats to go to or how to conduct themselves. In this case, we had a double problem because not only did Captain Johnson not hold lifeboat drills, the crew themselves were not that familiar with the setup. Half of them were new. Some of them had come over from the Puebla, the sister ship I mentioned a minute ago. So if the need for lifeboats should arise, which it did, nobody knows where to go, what to do. This leads to some real bad problems. Basically, it just became a free-for-all. When the ship hit the rocks in the middle of the night, in the middle of a storm, people are terrified, as they would be, and they don't know where to go. They don't know what to do once they get there. In the end, what happens is people just climb aboard lifeboats that are not ready yet to deploy. No one is there to lower the lifeboats, so they start hacking away at the ropes. All that's going to do, obviously, any of you who've been in the situation know, the lifeboat is going to tilt. It's going to fall into the ocean askew, assuming it goes in at all. And what happened was when the ship hit the rocks, just about every lifeboat either crashed against the boat and splintered, or it capsized and dumped everybody out and everybody drowned. Water's quite cold. It's January. Water's quite cold, and people are not very good swimmers. And even the ones who are weighted down with a lot of clothes. The women were terrified to get into the lifeboats for reasons we'll get into in a minute. So at any rate, Captain Johnson should have held lifeboat drills and he should have done it early. Instead, he didn't do it at all. Then he ignored advice. I think this may be where the excessive pride comes in, he ignored advice from some of his officers saying, I don't think we're where you think we are. You said you saw that that lighthouse. I don't remember seeing it. Now, the committee that was formed to investigate this wreck afterwards, 3-person committee formed by President Teddy Roosevelt, found that sighting was completely out of the blue. He had just made it up. At least that's their opinion, based on testimony of the survivors. There were not that many survivors, by the way, about 36, I think. Then there's another thing that Captain Johnson did, or failed to do, really. He waited until very late in the game to start taking soundings. Now, most of us know that these days soundings are done mostly electronically, but in those days, and occasionally still today, just to keep their hand in, I guess, people will throw a lead weight overboard. Very often has a cup in the bottom of it, and into that cup you insert wax or grease or some other sticky medium. And when it hits the bottom, you can bring back up a sample of that bottom. So you've thrown this line overboard, it's trailing behind the ship. Depending upon the scope or length of the line, if you're an experienced seaman, you can gauge the depth of where you are. And now you can also look and see what kind of bottom you're sailing over. Well, if you look at a chart, the charts note both of those things. So you need to find a depth that corresponds to where you think you are on the chart, and also the bottom should match. In his case, he didn't take any soundings at all until 2 days into the trip, into a 3-day trip. And when he did take them, they did not show what they should have shown in terms of the depth of water. At that point, he should have done the smart thing, which was to turn around. Remember, it's night, it's stormy. He should have turned the ship around, gone back out to sea, and waited. Those of you who are boatmen and boatwomen, you know that you're not in danger, generally, out at sea. When you're in danger is when you start to get too close to land, especially in the dark in a storm. So for the same reason that pilots like to have a lot of altitude, anybody here a pilot? It turns out that pilots and airplane and airline accidents have a lot in common with shipwrecks and other such accidents. Pilots like to have altitude because if something goes wrong, they have time to figure out what's going on. Maybe find a place to land, maybe restart an engine. They have time to think. If you're 100 feet off the ground and something goes badly, you don't have a lot of time to think. In the case of a ship at sea, if he's nearing land, and this ship, this whole voyage was relatively close to land. The land was in sight, or would have been had the weather been good, most of the trip. So he's pretty close to land all the time. He should know at that point, oh, I'm not where I think I ought to be. It's dark. This is not safe here. I'm going to turn around and head out to sea. And I'll wait until the storm calms down, daylight comes, and then I'll figure out where I am and how to get to a safe place. A ship following him about 12 hours, maybe it's more like 6 or 8 hours, behind him did exactly that. Ran into the same problem, terrific storm, not sure where he was, turned around and went back out to sea, came back in about 12 hours later, he was fine. That's what Captain Johnson should have done, but he didn't. Another mistake he made was he's having his watches run 6 to 9 hours. So he's got a man posted at the bow, 6 to 9 hours in the dark, in the cold, in the rain, waves crashing over him. That's too long. The committee said that's too long for, in those conditions, to stand a watch. The most a person could stay alert and coherent and do a good job was a couple of hours. 6 or 9 hours, the guy is guaranteed to either fall asleep or at least not be able to focus anymore. So that was a problem. And he made another mistake. Back to the pilots. One of the things that pilots are taught is you have to learn to trust your instruments. And that's apparently, I'm not a pilot, but I'm told that that's difficult to do, that you want to trust your gut instinct. But the reality is, especially in when you're in trouble or the weather is bad, your gut instinct is not always right. You can't tell, not only can you not tell which way is east and west, you may not be able to tell up from down. Seems like you ought to be able to do that, but apparently if you get confused enough and disoriented enough, you can lose sight of that too. So they tell you, just trust your instruments. Captain Johnson did not trust one of his most important instruments, which was his log. By log, I don't mean the book in which he wrote journal entries. We lost that. We never got to see that log. But the log is a mechanical device that you tow behind the vessel. It spins, it rotates, and you can count those revolutions, or the device can. And with it, basically, you can conduct a dead reckoning. You can figure out how far have I gone and in what direction. And that way I should be able to pinpoint my location. A little iffy, but it's worked for thousands of years, if you're careful about it. Well, he did not trust his log. He decided that his log was overrunning, meaning showing that he was moving too fast, and showing that he was moving faster than he was really moving. So he discounted that, and as a result, he sped, because of this current that was carrying him, he sped right past the strait where he should have turned east and hit the rocks on Vancouver Island instead. Here's the Davidson Current. We're showing it flowing north in the winter, right, barreling along, pushing him right at Vancouver Island, the west coast of Vancouver Island. This ship crashed in just about the worst place you could crash a ship. There was nothing there. There still is not much there to this day. The west coast of Vancouver Island is relatively desolate. If you want to go to the spot where this ship sank, you have to walk 18 kilometers along the trail till you get to the cliff overlooking the spot. There's nothing else there. Still, there was even less there at that time. So it was not a good place to crash a ship. There were technologies that were coming along that could have helped. One of those is radio. By 1906, there were ships that had radio, Marconi sets. That's Marconi on the left. That's actually the Radio Shack. Is anybody here a ham radio operator? Yeah, me too. Well, we still call it a Radio Shack. That's the Radio Shack aboard the Titanic, and that's the radio operator. And he actually survived the Titanic sinking. There were radios, but only in 40 or 50 vessels, and they tended to be I'm talking about commercial vessels, they tended to be very large, high class, first class ocean liners had radios in 1906. Come 1910, a law was passed that said if you're carrying more than 100 passengers, you have to have a radio, and you have to have a radio operator on board and ready to work 24/7. But in 1906, that was not true. And honestly, I don't know how much it would have helped, because think back, the place they crashed, there wasn't much immediate help available. There still isn't all that much help available. There's more than there was. In the sinking of the Titanic a few years later, the Titanic was actually less of a disaster percentage of counting, if you're looking at the percentage of deaths, percentage of the passengers, less of a disaster than the Valencia, because they did get a radio call out. They did rescue, I don't remember, 750 people, something like that. I'd like to think that radio would have helped the Valencia, but I don't know how much it would have helped. They did eventually get some ships out, mostly from Victoria, and sailing out there. That was actually part of the tragedy, because the ships that came out sailed to within about a mile of the Valencia and then just sat there. They did not come any closer. Even there were a couple smaller vessels that people argue could have been able to come closer. The big ships couldn't, because the water was pretty shallow. Remember, it's still stormy. You don't want to send a lifeboat out with 5 or 6 of your crew and lose them plus the passengers on the other ship. So they were between a rock and a hard place. But there was a lot of controversy about it, a lot of argument still about whether they should have done something. In the end, they did nothing. They sailed out there and watched the ship die and watched all those people die. Here's another technology that was coming along, but had not advanced enough yet to help. The Coast Guard, neither the U.S. Coast Guard nor the Canadian Coast Guard existed yet, but there were some life-saving stations scattered around. There weren't that many life-saving stations on the Pacific coast of the U.S. There were a fair number on the East Coast, because that's where the population density is and that's where the money was. The Pacific coast, and particularly Vancouver Island, was considered to be something of a backwater. It wasn't important enough. This is part of the tragedy, I guess. It was considered not important enough to make the investment to make sure that there were life-saving stations nearby. There are now, but there weren't at the time. Here's Molly's illustration of the ship actually as it strikes the rocks during the storm. Beautiful drawing. Thank you, Molly. I talked about the ships that came out and didn't do anything. They did manage to launch one life raft, a lifeboat really, and a group of other people that launched in a lifeboat that got immediately capsized and broken up, but did finally hit the land. There wasn't a beach. It's not like you could find a beach to land on. Captain Johnson did do an intelligent thing once they finally ran into trouble. He turned his vessel around and then tried to ram it up on the beach, so stern first, so that people could get off the stern and onto the beach. But there was no beach. So basically all I did was ride it up higher on the rocks. A few people did, two parties of about 9, I think, did get onto the rocks and managed to survive. They climbed to the top where there was a very rudimentary trail, and one group went east and one group went west. They were unaware of each other at the time. But as it happened, one went east and one went west. And that was a terrible mistake. This whole thing is just a cascade of mistakes. These groups eventually found help, but by the time they found help, in the form of a lighthouse keeper and his family who got more people out, it was too late for them to do anything. Anybody know what a Lyle gun is? It's not very common knowledge. A Lyle gun is basically a small cannon that is meant to fire a line. And you fire a line either from the ship to the shore or from the shore to a ship. And then you tie that line off to a bigger line and pull it across. And then once you've got a good heavy line, say from the ship to the shore, you could transport people on that line using a variety of devices. And they had, the Valencia had a Lyle gun. And they shot a number of lines, and a couple of them actually made it across the rocks to the cliff overlooking the wreck. But because the first group went east and the other group went west, there was nobody to grab that line and make it fast. So what happened was, hours later, a group traipsed across country, and they got to the cliff overlooking the wreck. They could look down on what was left of the ship, which wasn't much by then. And they could see people, women and children especially, tied to the mast so that they wouldn't be washed overboard. But the lines that had been shot across by then had frayed and broken. There was nothing they could do. So they literally stood on top of this cliff and watched these people die. That's sort of the culmination of this tragedy. Nobody did anything right, is what it ultimately comes down to. If the people that landed on the shore had either stayed there or at least left a person or two there, then there would have been somebody there to grasp that line and make it fast. And then they probably could have gotten another line tied to it and pulled across. And then they could have saved, I don't know if they could have saved everybody. The ship was getting destroyed at a pretty rapid rate, but they could have saved somebody. They could have saved more people, if not everybody. So it's too bad. I mentioned that the women were tied to the masts. Most of them would not get into the lifeboats, the women. And you can't really blame them for a couple of reasons. One is they've seen what had happened to the other people who'd gotten into the lifeboats. They all drowned. It didn't look like a good bet. The ship, as battered as it was, felt pretty stable. They're going to wait, especially when they look out and they see a mile away a line of steamships. They think, oh, look, those ships are coming to save us. The ships did not save them. And the women died, and the children died, tied to those masts, many of them, which is probably one of the saddest things about this. It's one of the things that makes it a tragedy. This is another thing that makes it a tragedy, I think. This is a stone at Mount Pleasant Cemetery in Seattle, not far from here, really. And beneath it are the remains of 26 unknown people from the wreck. bodies were washing up on the shore for weeks. Many of them were identified, but they didn't find all of them. We don't even exactly have an exact count of how many people were on board. They're guessing, 173 total, I think they said. But there really are just guessing. There's no up-to-date manifest. If there was, it went down with the ship. So they found some of the bodies, a large number of the bodies, but there are several that they never found. And then they found these people whom were not identifiable for one reason or another. You can imagine some of those reasons. There's not a lot of, like I said earlier, there's not a lot of people that remember this whole incident. And that's another sad part of this story. This is one of the few markers. There are a couple other markers, but this is one of the few ones that you'll have access to, that you could go visit today if you wanted. There's just, this is all there's left, basically. And that's part of what makes it a tragedy, I think. So, this book, I'd be happy if you bought the book, by the way. In fact, buy several if you like. They actually have a very nice display here at the museum. It's another thing the museum here does very well, is display things in their shop. If you happen to have brought one, I think I saw a person or two that was already carrying a copy, or you happen to purchase a copy, I'll be happy to sign it for you before you leave today. I think that's about all I have, because I want to leave some time for questions that you may have about the book and how it came to be, or about the Valencia. So I'll open it up to questions. Does anybody have questions? Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, sir. Oh, yeah. We're going to try and make sure you have a mic.
I'm going to come around with a microphone, and I would love for each of you to use the microphone so we can all hear your question.
The picture you have here with
Yeah.
all the people on board, was that departure time, or was that a different time that they took a
Different time. Good question. That was actually taken in 1890, and it was when the ship had been chartered by the Army for the Spanish-American War. So they were transporting troops.
Thank you for being here. Did the captain make it, or was he one of the lost souls?
He was one of the lost souls. Yeah, he went down with his ship. Not sure he had a choice, actually, but.
Good afternoon. Not a question about the ship specifically, but I'm very curious about your transition from English teacher to maritime historian.
If you live long enough, you get to have multiple careers. So I've been a teacher and an editor and a magazine writer. So I write in general. I like to write. And the other thing I love to do is research. And I happen to love boats and the sea. So when the opportunity came to basically, the very first thing I did was to write an annotation of Joshua Slocum's book, Sailing Alone Around the World, which led to the rest of these books. So I sort of found myself in this niche, although I didn't really intend to do that. I spent a few years as a software developer. That was a complete accident. I didn't mean to do that. So it just happens. So.
Just wondering about the relationship of the captain to his crew and to the passengers. And I'm probably way off on dates and stuff, but was there any chance that the captain had to round up people to ride on his boat?
No, that actually has happened a lot. But in this case, the ship and its sister ship Puebla were owned by the same steamship company. So what happened was, while Puebla was laid up, they took half of their crew and moved them over.
Hi, I recall about 50 years ago, a colleague of mine hiked along the west coast of Vancouver Island, and he described a trail, and he described the trail as having built after and as a direct consequence of the Valencia wreck.
Yep,
Is that?
he is
that
absolutely correct.
That trail.
The trail was there in a very rudimentary form when the ship crashed. It was basically there. It had probably been a game trail or something, many, many years before that. But it was kept there mainly to help keep up the telegraph lines that were strung along. But it wasn't a very good trail. It wasn't as long as it is now. It wasn't well kept. But after this wreck, what they said was, if people end up on this shore, there is nowhere else to go for them to go except to this trail. This trail has to be better. And that's exactly what they did. You were right. They enhanced the trail, they lengthened it, they widened it, and it's still there. It's part of that long, long trail now. It is, I have not been on it, but I've heard that it is very beautiful. And it's also very rugged. That's a tough trail. One of, I think, the 4 or 5 toughest trails in the country. There are actually 30 some odd ladders that you have to climb to get to the next step where you can continue on the trail. It's not an easy trail at all. I'm pretty sure I'm now officially too old to do it. So, yes, sir.
Hang on, I'm coming.
Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
What was the length of the hull and what was it made of? Was it a steel hull or a wooden hull?
I'm sorry, I can't hear the
Was
question.
it a wooden hull?
Yes.
It was.
Yeah.
Was the framing and everything was a complete wooden?
Well, she was clad in steel.
Okay, that was what.
Yeah.
Okay.
Didn't do her any good. I mean, those rocks,
Right. What was the length?
282 feet, I think.
What size ship at the time?
She was, it sounds, it's, mean-spirited to say, but she has been called a second-class ship under the command of a second-class captain.
You mentioned a lot of the damage to the light ships themselves when the ship crashed. I was curious about any other safety equipment they may have had. Do you know if they had any rudimentary life jackets available for any of the passengers or crew?
I am so glad you asked that question. Did we pay him to ask that question? They had 6 lifeboats, a workboat, and 2 life rafts. But they had more life jackets than were required and more than they needed. However, only a few of them were of cork. And those were said to be quite good. The rest of them were made of a reed, basically, and those were said to be quite bad. And in fact, there was a lot of controversy over whether they should have been allowed on the ship at all. They took some of those, to their credit, they took some of those reed life jackets and they tied weights to them and put them in the water. And people testing them said that they still stayed buoyant even after, I think it was 17 hours. But that's not the gist of it's not what most people in the know said. There were sailors on those ships that said, yeah, if we have to go work for this particular steamship company, we bring our own life vests made of cork. And there's a reason for that. So, any other questions? Yeah.
A footnote on the wildness of Vancouver Island on the West Coast. I had a friend in the early 1980s hike the West Coast, and he's put his tent on the beach there. When he woke in the morning, there are tracks going by his tent. A cougar had passed by him during the night.
That, you know, and that's not surprising. That was a real wild place in 1906. It's still a wild place. It's a beautiful place. Leslie and I may get to go back there, I hope. She's saying yes, so apparently we do, yeah. It's a beautiful place, and but it's not a good place to run your ship on a rock, up on the rocks. So, anything else? Any other questions? Well, then I appreciate your coming out and spending some time with us. Enjoy your museum. It is your museum, and it's a beautiful one. So thank you very much.